In the Obsidian Room, a place where power and wealth reign, the most dangerous person isn't the tattooed mafia boss across the table, nor the distracted billionaire absorbed in his phone. It's Brandy, the quiet waitress who's more than she seems. While the elites are lost in their digital worlds, Brandy is keenly aware of the physical danger lurking around them. As she serves a glass of wine, she notices the deadly plot unfolding, an assassination in the making. Brandy is the only one who sees the signs, and it's up to her to act before it's too late.
Before I tell you what Yolanda did next to save the Mafia boss, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will leave you astonished. Now let's dive into it. The Obsidian Room didn't just smell of money, it smelled of the quiet, sterile arrogance that only comes with absolute power. It was a cathedral of glass and mahogany where the city's most dangerous prayers were answered in whispers. Brandy Williams moved through the thick, amber-lit air like a premonition, her footsteps swallowed by the plush velvet carpet. She was a master of the middle distance, never quite looking at the patrons, yet seeing the world in high definition. To the men seated at the center table, she was merely a vessel for the wine, a necessary but forgettable part of the evening's high-stakes theater. At the heart of the room sat Choi Ji-ho. He didn't sit so much as he occupied the space, a predator at rest. His black suit was tailored with a precision that bordered on hostility, but it was the ink that truly spoke. The dragon tattoos coiling up his neck and disappearing beneath his collar were a map of every life he had taken and every war he had won. His eyes, dark and unblinking, were fixed on the man across from him. Ji-ho didn't need to speak to command the room. His silence was a heavy, suffocating weight that forced everyone else to breathe a little faster. Across from him, Bruno Dent provided a jarring contrast. While Ji-ho was a statue of ancient, iron-fisted authority, Bruno was the embodiment of modern, detached entitlement. He was a man who looked like he had been born in a boardroom and raised by algorithms. His white dress shirt was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, but his attention was nowhere near the five-star meal cooling between them. Bruno was hunched slightly forward, his thumbs dancing over the glowing screen of his smartphone. To anyone else, he looked like a bored executive caught in the relentless pull of the digital world. He was the distracted associate, the man too busy with his stocks to notice the world around him. But Brandy noticed. As she approached with the bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti cradled in a white linen cloth, she saw the discordance in Bruno's performance. His focus was too singular, his thumb movements too rhythmic. He wasn't scrolling, he was tracking. Every few seconds his eyes would flicker from the screen to the gold Patek Philippe on Ji-ho's wrist, then back again. It was a countdown, a synchronization of two different worlds that were about to collide. Ji-ho reached out, his hand steady and scarred, resting his fingers near the base of his empty crystal glass. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps just the habit of a man who believed nothing in this room could hurt him. The tension at the table was a live wire, humming with the static of a business deal that felt more like a hostage negotiation. Brandy leaned in, the neck of the bottle poised to pour. She could feel the heat radiating from Ji-ho and the cold, clinical energy coming off Bruno. In that moment, the only thing that existed was the center table, a stage where a king was waiting for his drink and a snake was waiting for the clock to strike 0. The wine breathed in its decanter, but the air in the Obsidian Room felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by an impending vacuum. Brandy lingered just outside the immediate halo of the center table's light, her eyes performing a rhythmic sweep of the peripheral shadows. It was here, in the blurred edges of the room, that the real story was being written.
She saw a busboy she didn't recognize. A man whose gait was too stiff for the service industry, lacking the fluid, apologetic grace of a career server. He moved with the heavy, deliberate precision of someone carrying a concealed weight. He passed the staging station near table 3, and for a fraction of a second, his hand hovered over the backup crystal stemware intended for Ji-ho's table. To the untrained eye, it was a clumsy adjustment of a tray. To Brandy, it was the geometry of a kill. She watched through the reflection of a polished brass sconce as the man's gloved thumb pressed firmly against the interior rim of a fresh glass. There was no liquid, no visible residue, just the faint, oily sheen of a specialized neurotoxin, clear, odorless, and lethal upon contact with the lips. Her father's voice echoed in the back of her mind. The mouth can lie, Brandy, but the hands have no choice but to be honest. The busboy's hands were honest. They were the hands of an executioner. He swapped the pristine glass on the table for the tainted one with a sleight of hand that would have fooled a camera, but not a woman who lived in the details. Brandy felt a cold prickle of sweat trace the line of her spine. She looked back at Bruno Dent. He hadn't moved. His gaze remained glued to the glowing rectangle of his phone, but his jaw was tight, the muscles corded like iron cables. He was the conductor of this silent orchestra. The distraction was a shield, a way to claim plausible deniability when the man across from him suddenly clutched his throat and collapsed into the expensive upholstery. The poison was now inches from Choi Ji-ho's hand. The Mafia boss was leaning forward, his intense dark eyes narrowing as he spoke a low, guttural sentence in Korean that made Bruno's thumb pause for a heartbeat. Ji-ho reached out, his fingers closing around the stem of the very glass the phantom busboy had just placed. Brandy realized then that the business associate wasn't just looking for a better deal, he was looking for a vacancy. Every instinct Brandy possessed screamed at her to keep walking, to remain the ghost she had spent years perfecting. If she interfered, the shadow world would turn its gaze toward her, and a ghost cannot survive the light. But as Ji-ho began to lift the glass toward his mouth, Brandy saw the reflection of her own face in the wine, a face that could no longer hide behind a starch white shirt and a silver tray. The geometry was set, the variables were locked, and the only thing standing between the predator and his grave was a waitress who was tired of being part of the furniture. The blue light from Bruno Dent's smartphone cast a ghostly artificial pallor over his features, making him look less like a man and more like a machine calculating an inevitable outcome. Brandy stood frozen for a heartbeat, the heavy silver tray in her hands feeling like an anchor. From her vantage point, she could see what Choi Ji-ho could not. The screen wasn't displaying a stock ticker or an urgent email. It was a digital stopwatch, the glowing white numbers flickering downward with cold, mechanical precision. Bruno's thumb didn't just hover, it trembled with a frantic, suppressed energy. Every time the numbers hit a 5-second interval, his gaze would snap to the wine glass in Ji-ho's hand, then to the exit, and finally back to the countdown. He wasn't just waiting for a death, he was coordinating a coup. The phone was a trigger, a synchronization tool for a wider betrayal that likely extended to the gunmen waiting in the darkened sedans outside, or the phantom busboy currently vanishing into the service corridors. Ji-ho, oblivious to the digital executioner sitting across from him, began to tilt the glass. The dark red liquid swirled against the tainted rim, a whirlpool of Romanée Conti and neurotoxin. Brandy's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of panic that threatened to shatter her mask of professional serenity. She realized that Bruno's detachment was a form of predatory camouflage. He was counting the seconds until the maid of soul became a widow and he became a king. The air in the obsidian room seemed to hum with the frequency of Bruno's countdown. To Ji-ho, the silence was the comfortable quiet of a dominant power. To Brandy, it was the sound of a fuse burning toward a powder keg. She saw Bruno's thumb flattened against the screen, locking the final 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3. The glass touched Ji-ho's lower lip.
In that sliver of time, the hierarchy of the room flipped. The billionaire and the boss were secondary. The only person who held the future of the city in her hands was the woman in the starch-white shirt who was about to break the first rule of her life: never be seen. The rhythmic ticking of Bruno's digital stopwatch seemed to synchronize with the pounding in Brandy's chest, a heavy, dull thud that felt loud enough to shatter the crystal on the table. In the half-second before the glass met Ji-ho's mouth, a lifetime of lessons in survival flooded her mind. She had been raised to be a ghost, a silent witness to the world's cruelties, because ghosts don't get shot. Ghosts don't disappear into concrete foundations. Her father's voice, usually a source of strength, was now a warning. A diplomat's daughter stays neutral, Brandy. To choose a side is to choose a target. If she stayed silent, Choi Ji-ho would be dead within minutes. The room would dissolve into the sterile chaos of a medical emergency. Bruno Dent would inherit a kingdom of blood and shipping lanes, and Brandy would go back to the locker room, change out of her starch-white shirt, and disappear into the Seoul night, a witness to a crime no one would ever prove. It was the safe path. It was the path of the invisible. But as she looked at Choi Ji-ho, she didn't see a mafia boss or a predator. She saw a man who, despite his terrifying ink and violent history, was sitting at a table in a moment of rare, unguarded trust. Across from him, Bruno Dent was a hollow shell of a human being, a man who didn't even have the courage to look his victim in the eye, preferring the blue light of a screen to the weight of a conscience.
The internal struggle was a violent collision of two identities: the servant who was paid to be part of the furniture, and the woman who refused to be an accomplice to a coward's victory. The tray in her hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She knew that the moment she moved, the cage of her invisibility would shatter. She would no longer be the girl who refilled glasses. She would be a player in a game where the losers were never seen again. Her breath caught in her throat. The neurotoxin was a millimeter from Ji-ho's tongue. To act was to invite the wrath of a business associate who had already proven he would kill for profit. To remain still was to die a different kind of death, the death of the soul that comes from watching a murder you could have stopped. The velvet air of the obsidian room grew cold. Brandy's fingers tightened on the silver tray until her knuckles turned as white as her apron. The diplomat's daughter was gone. The architect of a new fate was about to step into the light. She had spent her life watching the powerful, but tonight she would be the one to decide who kept their power and who lost their life. The moment of impact arrived with the sound of a shattering side plate. Brandy didn't just stumble, she choreographed a catastrophe. As Choi Ji-ho's lips brushed the cold, tainted rim of his glass, Brandy's shoulder clipped the edge of the mahogany table, sending a cascade of bone china and silver cutlery toward the floor. The noise was an explosion in the hushed sanctuary of the obsidian room, a jagged tear in the velvet silence that forced every eye, including Ji-ho's, to snap toward the wreckage at his feet. In that singular heartbeat of chaos, the world slowed to a crawl. Bruno Dent's thumb froze over his glowing screen, his eyes widening as the countdown was interrupted by the sheer, clumsy human error of a servant. It was the only distraction powerful enough to break the focus of a predator. As Ji-ho instinctively pulled his head back to avoid the perceived splash, Brandy's right hand moved with a velocity that would have been invisible to a high-speed camera. She didn't just reach for the glass, she integrated it into a recovery. Under the guise of steadying herself, her fingers swept the poisoned stemware from the table, tucking it into the folds of her white linen serving cloth, while simultaneously depositing a pristine, identical glass from her tray in its place. The exchange was a masterpiece of physics and desperation.
The wine swirled violently, a dark crimson vortex that mimicked a spill, yet not a single drop touched the tablecloth. "I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Choi," Brandy gasped, her voice trembling with a perfect mix of practiced fear and genuine adrenaline. She was on her knees in an instant, her hands fluttering over the scattered silverware, the poisoned glass now safely hidden in the dark hollow of her service station nearby. Ji-ho's eyes, dark and piercing, settled on her. For a terrifying second, he didn't move. He looked at the shattered plate, then at the girl who was now a trembling mess of apologies, and finally at the glass of wine that appeared exactly as he had left it.
The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Bruno Dent sat rigid, his blue-lit face twisted in a mask of confusion. The stopwatch on his phone hit 0, the numbers flashing a silent, useless command for a death that hadn't arrived. Bruno's gaze darted from the screen to Ji-ho, his breath hitching as he realized the boss was still breathing. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the crash. Brandy continued to clear the debris, her head bowed, her ghost persona shielding her even as her heart threatened to burst from her chest. She had done the unthinkable. She had reached into the cogs of a mafia execution and jammed them with a porcelain plate. Ji-ho reached out once more. His hand was steady as he grasped the stem of the clean glass. He didn't drink immediately. He held it up to the light, the red vintage glowing like a ruby against the dim mahogany of the room. He looked at Brandy, then at Bruno, a cold, dawning realization beginning to flicker in the depths of his eyes. The game had not just changed, the board had been flipped. The heavy silence that followed the crash of porcelain was more deafening than the shatter itself. Brandy remained low to the floor, her fingers trembling as she gathered the jagged shards, but her eyes never left the polished mahogany of the table's underside. Above her, the atmosphere had shifted from cold calculation to a lethal, vibrating tension. Choi Ji-ho held the stem of the clean glass with a grip that looked like it could crush the crystal into dust. He didn't drink. Instead, he watched the sweat begin to bead on Bruno Dent's upper lip. Bruno's phone lay forgotten on the table, the screen finally dark, its silent command for death gone unheeded. His mask of detached boredom had completely disintegrated, replaced by the frantic, darting eyes of a man who realized the trap had snapped shut on the wrong person. "You seem disappointed, Bruno," Ji-ho said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to crawl across the table. He didn't look at the mess on the floor. His focus was a laser beam fixed on his associate's throat. "The service was not to your liking, or was it the timing?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Ji-ho," Bruno stammered, his voice climbing an octave. He reached for his own glass, the one he had kept safely at his side, but his hand shook so violently that the wine sloshed over the rim. Ji-ho's hand shot across the table, his tattooed fingers pinning Bruno's wrist to the mahogany with the speed of a striking cobra. The sound of bone hitting wood echoed in the hushed room. With his other hand, Ji-ho slowly slid the fresh, clean glass toward Bruno. "The vintage is excellent," Ji-ho whispered, his face inches from Bruno's. "Drink." The game had flipped with the brutal finality of a coin toss. The invisible architecture of Bruno's betrayal was now laid bare under the amber lights of the obsidian room. He looked at the glass, then at the service station, where Brandy had vanished with the poisoned stemware, and finally back to the dragon tattoos on Ji-ho's neck.
He knew that to drink was to die in agony, but to refuse was to admit he had tried to kill a king. Brandy stood up slowly, the shards of the plate wrapped in the linen cloth like a shroud. She stayed in the shadows of the periphery, once again the ghost, but her eyes met Ji-ho's for a fleeting electric second. In that look, the Mafia boss saw the truth. The waitress wasn't a clumsy servant. She was the only reason his heart was still beating. Bruno's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at the wine, the dark red liquid reflecting his own terrified face. The associate who had spent the evening hiding behind a digital screen was now forced to face the physical reality of his own malice. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick, until the first sob of pure, unadulterated terror escaped Bruno's lips. The distracted businessman was gone, leaving only a trapped animal in a bespoke suit, staring into the ruby depths of a glass that offered no mercy. The air in the obsidian room grew frigid, the kind of cold that precedes a terminal frost. Bruno Dent's sob was a jagged, pathetic sound that stripped away the last of his executive dignity. He sat paralyzed, staring at the deep red wine that had become a mirror of his own demise. He didn't need to drink it. The mere existence of the glass was his confession. Troy G. Ho stood up slowly, the movement possessed by a terrifying liquid grace. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached down and picked up Bruno's smartphone, the screen still dark, its digital heart stopped at 0. Ji-Ho turned the device over in his hands, as if it were a strange, primitive relic. "You thought power was something you could download, Bruno," Ji-Ho said, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum. "You thought the world was a series of numbers on a screen, but blood isn't digital." Ji-Ho made a subtle gesture, a slight tilt of his head toward the shadows. From the periphery of the room, 2 men appeared. They weren't dressed like the elite patrons of the lounge. They wore the dark, heavy wool coats of the docks, their faces as expressionless as the stone walls of a fortress. They moved toward the table with a synchronized mechanical efficiency that signaled the end of any negotiation. Bruno tried to stand, his legs turning to water, his hands frantically searching for a grip on the mahogany table. "Ji-Ho, wait! We can talk about this. The shipping lanes. I can give you the European contacts. I was pressured. The words died in his throat as the 2 men reached him. One gripped his shoulder with a hand that looked like it could crush a bowling ball, and the other took his arm with a firm, practiced grip. There was no struggle. Bruno Dent had spent his life in a world of abstractions, and he was utterly powerless against the raw physical reality of the men who now claimed him.
"The bill for tonight is very high, Bruno," Ji-Ho whispered, leaning in so close that his dragon tattoos seemed to writhe under the amber lights. "And I never let a debt go unpaid. You wanted to see a king fall. Now you'll see how a traitor is erased." As they began to lead him away, Bruno's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for a witness, a savior, or even a glimmer of mercy. He looked at the other patrons, but they had already turned away, their eyes fixed on their own plates, their ears deaf to the sound of a man being deleted from existence. Finally, his gaze landed on Brandy. She stood by the service station, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She was the ghost again, the invisible witness who had seen the beginning and the end. In her eyes, Bruno saw no pity, only the cold, analytical clarity of a woman who had decoded his soul and found it lacking. The heavy mahogany doors of the obsidian room swung open and then closed with a final, definitive thud. The sound echoed through the sanctuary, a period at the end of a sentence. Bruno Dent was gone, led into the Seoul night, where the black sedans were no longer waiting for a coup, but for a delivery. Ji-Ho remained standing at the table, his gaze fixed on the empty chair. He picked up the clean glass of wine, swirled it once, and then set it down without drinking. He turned toward the shadows where Brandy stood. The air was still heavy with the scent of tobacco and aged whiskey, but the game had moved beyond the table. The final bill had been served, and the room was ready for its next architect.
The obsidian room began to breathe again, but the air was different now, charged with the ozone of a lightning strike that had just missed its mark. The other patrons returned to their hushed conspiracies, yet the center table remained an island of profound, vibrating stillness. Brandy didn't retreat to the kitchen. She stood her ground in the amber-lit periphery, the linen shroud in her hands still concealing the evidence of the neurotoxin. She felt the weight of Choi Ji-ho's gaze before she saw it. It wasn't the look a master gives a servant. It was the look a general gives a scout who has just saved the flank. Ji-ho didn't gesture for more wine. He sat back, his tattooed hands resting flat on the mahogany, the inked dragons on his skin appearing to settle into a contented coil. He looked at the empty chair where Bruno Dent had sat, a man who had tried to play a digital game in a world made of bone and steel. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Ji-ho reached out and pulled the chair once occupied by the traitor toward the side of the table. "A ghost is a useful thing, Brandy," Ji-ho said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried across the short distance. It was the first time he had spoken her name, and it felt like a brand. "A ghost can drift through walls, hear the whispers of the dead, and see the daggers in the dark. But a ghost is always on the outside, looking in." He tapped the edge of the mahogany table, right next to the seat he had just moved. Bruno thought he was the smartest man in Seoul because he had an algorithm. He died because he didn't realize that the most powerful weapon in this room wasn't his phone. It was the woman who knew exactly which glass held the poison. Brandy felt the final threads of her invisibility dissolve. The starch-white shirt and the black bow tie felt like a costume she had outgrown. The internal struggle that had nearly paralyzed her moments ago had been replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She realized that Ji-ho wasn't just offering her a reward, he was offering her a partnership. He was a predator who had spent his life surrounded by sycophants and snakes, and he had finally found someone who spoke his language, the language of the unspoken. "In my world, everyone is looking for the light," Ji-ho continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a predatory respect. "They want the fame, the title, the seat at the head of the table. They are blinded by it. I don't need another soldier. I need an oracle. I need someone who lives in the shadows and decodes the geometry of the kill before the first move is made." He paused, the light of the brass sconces glinting off the scars on his knuckles. "The obsidian room is a gallery of lies, Brandy. You've spent years watching it from the hallways. I'm offering you a seat within the frame. You will no longer serve the wine. You will tell me who is trying to poison it." Brandy didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the shadows, the silver tray left behind on a nearby sideboard like a discarded relic of a former life. She walked toward the center table, her posture no longer that of a servant, but of a woman who had just inherited the keys to a kingdom. As she sat in the new seat, she felt the shift in the room's gravity. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the architect of the silence. The transition from the floor of the obsidian room to the upper echelons of Choi Ji-ho's empire was not a journey of miles, but a total realignment of the soul. 6 months after the night of the shattered porcelain, Brandy Williams stood on the balcony of a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the neon veins of Seoul. She was no longer draped in the starch-white cotton of a servant. She was encased in charcoal silk that moved like liquid smoke against her skin. The heavy weight of the silver tray had been replaced by the light, terrifying responsibility of a phone that held the encryption keys to a dozen different underworlds. Behind her, the penthouse was a study in cold, minimalist power. Jiho sat at a low table, his tattooed neck visible above a dark turtleneck, reviewing a ledger. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't need to. They moved in a silent, perfected choreography. Brandy had become more than an advisor. She was the filter through which all reality passed before it reached the boss. Every contract, every associate, and every business dinner was first scrutinized by the woman who could read the truth in a trembling finger or a misplaced glance.
She looked down at the city, the lights flickering like the data on Bruno Dent's dead smartphone. She realized then that her life as a ghost hadn't been a period of hiding, but a long, meticulous apprenticeship. She had spent years at the periphery, studying the anatomy of power, how it was held, how it was lost, and how easily it could be poisoned. She had never been a background character in someone else's play. She had been the only one in the room learning the script. A soft chime echoed from her pocket. She pulled out her device, not to count down a death, but to preempt one. A new associate was requesting a meeting at a local lounge. She swiped through the dossier, her eyes instantly locking onto a small detail: the man's previous ties to a shipping firm in Europe, Bruno's old firm. A faint, sharp smile touched her lips. She wasn't just a survivor of the game. She was the one who had redesigned the board. The invisibility she once curated for safety was now a weapon she deployed for control. To the world, she was the mysterious oracle behind the Dragon of Soul, a legend spoken of in fearful whispers. But to herself, she was simply the woman who knew that the most powerful person in any room is the one everyone assumes has no voice. Jiho finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the glass. There was no need for words. He saw the clarity in her posture, the same steel-trap intelligence that had saved his life in the obsidian room. "The car is ready, Brandy," he said, his voice a low, respectful rasp. "Good," she replied, her voice steady and resonant. "I've already seen how this meeting ends. We aren't going there to negotiate. We're going there to show them what happens when they forget to look at the shadows." She turned away from the view, walking toward the door with the fluid, intentional grace of a woman who finally owned the space she occupied. The door closed behind them with the same definitive mahogany thud of that first night, not as an ending, but as the first note in a new, more dangerous symphony. The ghost was gone. The architect had arrived.